She didn't cry when they threw her out. She didn't beg. She just walked, boots, bleeding, dress torn, the whole town watching her go like she was something they'd already forgotten. When she finally stopped walking, it was in front of a stranger's fire, deep in the Montana mountains, where a cowboy sat alone with his rifle and his silence. She didn't ask for food. She didn't ask for mercy. She looked at him and said the three words that would change both their lives forever. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt like the world counted you out before you even had a chance to prove yourself, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 came to Caldwell Creek, Montana, like a sentence nobody had agreed to serve. The heat settled into the valley early that year, long before June turned its face toward July, pressing down on the rooftops and the dusty Main Street with the kind of weight that made men short-tempered and women careful. The creek itself had dropped to little more than a whisper along the rocks, and the cattle on the surrounding ranches moved slow and irritable through the yellowed grass, as if even the animals understood that something in that summer was going to break before it got better. Abigail Carter had lived in Caldwell Creek for 3 years, not long enough to be trusted, not short enough to be forgiven for trying. She had come with her husband Thomas, a soft-spoken schoolteacher who believed in second chances and new towns and the particular mercy of the American West. Thomas had died 14 months after they arrived, a fever that moved too fast for any doctor to catch, and he had left Abigail with a rented room, a small savings account at Caldwell Creek's only bank, and a reputation that depended entirely on being somebody's wife. She was nobody's wife now, and Caldwell Creek had very strong opinions about that. It started with small things. The way Meredith Holt stopped saving her a seat at Sunday service. The way the women at the dry goods store went quiet when Abigail walked in, then started talking again at a slightly different pitch about slightly different things. The way Sheriff Dale Purcell started finding reasons to check that her rent was paid, her paperwork was in order, her presence in town was still justifiable. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. Because Abigail Carter had been raised to believe that dignity was something you kept inside yourself where nobody could reach in and take it. Her mother had told her that. Her grandmother before that. The women in her family had survived harder things than small-town cruelty, and they had survived with their backs straight and their mouths closed, and Abigail intended to do the same. Then Gerald Marsh came to town. Gerald Marsh was the kind of man who made other men feel important just by standing near him. He owned 3 ranches in the territory and had connections to the county land office that everyone in Caldwell Creek understood, even if nobody said it plainly. He wore his wealth the way some men wore a weapon, quietly, visibly, and with full intention. He arrived in June, took a room at the Caldwell Creek Hotel, and within 2 weeks had made himself the most talked-about man in the valley. He also decided he wanted to marry Abigail Carter. She said no. She said it politely the first time. She said it clearly the second time. By the third time, she said it standing in the doorway of the post office, with half the town watching, and Gerald Marsh's face went the particular color of a man who had never once been told no by someone he considered beneath him. "You don't seem to understand your situation," he said very quietly. "I understand it fine," Abigail said. She went home. She locked her door. She sat at the small table by the window and listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening, and she told herself that Gerald Marsh was the kind of problem that passed if you didn't feed it. She was wrong. It took him 4 days. 4 days to speak to the bank manager, a weasel-faced man named Orrin Stokes, who owed Marsh more favors than he could count. 4 days to have her small savings account flagged for a clerical irregularity that nobody could quite explain. 4 days to have a word with her landlord, a nervous man named Pratt, who had 3 outstanding loans from Marsh's business partners and could not afford to be principled about it. On the morning of July 3rd, Pratt knocked on her door and told her she had until sunset to clear her belongings. "On what grounds?" Abigail said. Pratt wouldn't meet her eyes. "Property's being sold," he said. "New buyer wants vacant possession. This building has been a boarding house for 11 years. "Ma'am," Pratt said, and he actually looked pained, which she supposed was something, "I'm sorry, I truly am. But there ain't anything I can do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, there is. But you won't." She closed the door in his face and started packing. She did not allow herself to cry. There would be time for that later in some private place where it wouldn't be observed and catalogued and added to the account of things that made Abigail Carter someone who didn't belong in Caldwell Creek. She packed her clothes, her books, the photograph of Thomas that she kept on the nightstand, the small tin box that held her remaining money, $63.40, which was not enough for a train ticket east and barely enough for a week in the next town over. She carried her bags down to the main street at 4 in the afternoon while the sun was still brutal overhead, and she stood on the boardwalk and tried to think clearly about what came next. Gerald Marsh was standing across the street. I wasn't looking at her. He was talking to two men outside the hardware store, laughing at something his hat pushed back on his head in a way that looked casual and was not. But she knew he knew she was there. She could feel it in the deliberate way he kept his back 3/4 turned, the performance of not noticing her, which was worse than being watched directly. She picked up her bags and walked north. There was nothing north of Caldwell Creek, except the mountain trail that wound up through the pines toward the high pastures, where a handful of remote ranchers ran their cattle through the summer months. She had no reason to go that way. She had no plan exactly. She just knew that she could not stand on that boardwalk with Gerald Marsh 20 feet away, and her entire life reduced to what she could carry and maintain the kind of dignity her mother had talked about. Not without walking somewhere first. Not without putting distance between herself and the thing that had just happened. She walked for 2 hours before she admitted to herself that she didn't know where she was going. The mountain trail was steeper than she'd expected, and narrower, cut through limestone and pine root in a way that demanded attention she didn't have to spare. Her boots. Good boots. Thomas had bought them the year before he died, and she'd kept them carefully, were not made for this kind of terrain, and she could feel the blisters forming along her left heel and the ball of her right foot with a specificity that was almost clarifying. Pain, at least, was honest. By the time the sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the temperature in the pines fell with the sudden decisiveness of mountain evenings, Abigail had covered perhaps 6 miles of trail and was considerably less certain of herself than she had been when she left town. She stopped on a flat rock and set down her bags and looked at the sky through the trees, which had gone from gold to the particular dark orange that preceded full dark, and she allowed herself for exactly 30 seconds to consider the full extent of what she was doing. She had $63. She had her bags. She had a mountain trail that went up into country she didn't know in the direction of ranches that may or may not have been occupied in the first week of July, in a territory where mountain weather could turn without warning. She picked up her bags and kept walking. She smelled the fire before she saw it. Wood smoke, clean and sharp, with something underneath it. Coffee maybe, and the faint animal smell of horses nearby. It came from somewhere above and to her left off the main trail, and she stopped walking and stood very still for a moment and thought about what her options were. She could keep going up the trail. Into darkness, into country she didn't know on feet that were past complaining and had gone to a kind of resigned ache. Or she could walk toward the fire. She set her shoulders and walked toward the fire. The camp was set in a small clearing off the trail. Not a camp exactly, more a working stop, the kind a rancher made when he was moving cattle and needed to spend a night on the high ground before pushing the herd further up the mountain. There was a fire built competent and low, the way people built fires when they knew what they were doing, and a coffee pot sitting on a flat stone at its edge, and a saddle on the ground nearby with its strap half repaired, and a man. Howe was sitting on a log with the saddle leather in his hands, working a needle through it with the focused economy of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He was tall, she could tell, even seated with the particular broadness through the shoulders that came from years of physical work, rather than any deliberate effort. Dark hair longer than fashion required. A beard that was more working cowboy than anything else. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and the firelight moved over the side of his face in a way that showed the lines around his eyes and mouth, the weathering of a man who spent his life outdoors. He heard her before she was fully into the clearing. His hand went to the rifle beside him, not grabbing it, not raising it, just placing his palm on the stock in a gesture that said, "I know you're there, And I am not surprised, and you should know that. And he looked up at her with eyes that were dark and even, and gave nothing away. They looked at each other across the fire. Abigail was aware suddenly and completely of what she must look like. Dressed dusty from the trail, hair pulled loose from its pins by 6 miles of mountain walking, bags in both hands. Blisters, she was fairly certain, were bleeding inside her left boot. She was also aware that she was alone on a mountain in the dark with a man she had never seen, and that the only thing between her and whatever this situation was going to become was the specific way she handled the next 30 seconds. She set down her bags. She straightened her back. She looked at him directly. "I am not asking for food," she said. "I am not asking for money. I am asking if you have any work that needs doing on your ranch, and if you do, I would like to do it in exchange for somewhere to sleep and enough to eat." A pause. The fire moved between them. The man studied her with those dark, even eyes, and she got the sense that he was not a man who reached conclusions quickly. Not because he was slow, but because he understood that quick conclusions were often wrong. "You walked up from Caldwell Creek," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "In those boots." She looked down at her feet, then back up at him. "They're good boots." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more contained than that. "Ethan Walker," he said. "Abigail Carter." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once toward the other side of the fire. "Coffee's hot," he said. "Sit down before you fall down. We can talk about work in the morning." Abigail Carter sat down. She did not let herself think about what she'd just done. She did not let herself feel the relief of being off her feet, or the warmth of the fire against her face, or the smell of the coffee, when Ethan Walker poured it into a tin cup and set it on the rock beside her without comment. She just sat and drank and kept her back straight and watched the fire. "You running from something," Ethan said after a while. He was back to the saddle, the needle moving through the leather again. "I'm walking toward something," Abigail said. "I just don't know what it is yet." He glanced up at her. Something shifted in those dark eyes, not sympathy exactly. Recognition, maybe. "Caldwell Creek's Gerald Marsh have anything to do with it?" he said. She looked at him sharply. "I know Marsh," Ethan said in a tone that told her everything she needed to know about the nature of that knowledge. "And I know the kind of thing he does to people who tell him no." The word landed between them like a stone in still water. "I told him no," Abigail said. "I figured," Ethan said. He finished the stitch on the saddle strap, set it down, poured himself coffee, looked at the fire for a long moment. "My name's Walker," he said again, though she already had it. "I run cattle on the high pasture through summer, bring them down before first snow. Ranch is another 3 miles up this trail. Got a bunkhouse that's empty. My last hand left in May, and I haven't replaced him. Hot water, clean bed separate from the main house." Abigail said nothing. "The work is hard," he said. "Mountain terrain, unpredictable weather, cattle that have opinions. I don't have time to explain everything twice. I learn fast," Abigail said. "You know horses. My father raised them. You know cattle. I know enough to learn the rest." He looked at her, then a long, direct look, the kind that evaluated rather than admired, that was interested in what a person was made of rather than what they looked like. Abigail had been looked at a great many ways in her 31 years, and most of them she could have done without, but this one she didn't mind. This one felt honest. "I pay fair wages," he said, "same as I'd pay a man for the same work." Something about that stopped her cold. In 3 years in Caldwell Creek, she had never once heard those words from anyone. Not from the dry goods store owner who'd wanted someone to do inventory but offered half what he paid his male clerk. Not from the widow Hartley who'd needed help with her kitchen garden and thought that room and board was generous compensation for a woman with nowhere else to go. "Same as I'd pay a man for the same work." "All right," Abigail said. Ethan Walker nodded as if that settled it. He drank his coffee. He looked at the fire. He did not ask her anything more that night, did not press for the shape of her story, or the details of what Gerald Marsh had done, or whether she had family somewhere who ought to know where she was. He simply let the fire and the mountain quiet do what they did, which was make most things feel slightly more manageable than they had seemed an hour before. Abigail drank her coffee and looked at the stars appearing through the pines above them, and thought about her mother, who had said dignity was something you kept inside where nobody could reach it. She thought her mother might have also added, and sometimes in the dark on a mountain, a stranger proves it's true. She slept in Ethan Walker's tent that night. He insisted, took his bedroll outside without discussion. Waved off her protest with a single flat gesture that communicated, "I am not arguing about this," and she slept the deep animal sleep of a person whose body had simply run out of resources for anything else. In the morning, Ethan Walker made coffee and cornbread on the campfire and handed her a portion without ceremony, and they ate in a silence that was, Abigail realized, not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had each decided something and were letting the decision settle. "Trail to the ranch is steep in the middle section," Ethan said as he kicked dirt over the fire. "There's a switchback about a mile up that the horses don't like. You'll want to watch your footing." "I'll manage," Abigail said. He looked at her sideways. Something in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite respect, something in between. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon you will." They packed the camp in the thin mountain morning, the air still cold enough to see their breath despite the July date, and Ethan loaded the pack horse with efficient movements that suggested long practice, and Abigail helped where she could, watching his methods and filing them away, because learning fast meant watching first. When they started up the trail, Ethan leading the horse, Abigail walked beside him with her bags over her shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a long while, and the mountain rose up around them in all its particular summer indifference. The pines huge and patient, the rock faces catching the early light. Then from below on the trail she heard it. Voices, more than one, carrying up through the pines with the particular clarity of mountain air which flattened distance and made things sound closer than they were. She heard her name. "Carter woman went up the north trail last evening. Marsh wants her found. Walker's range up that way, he'd have seen her if she came through." Ethan had heard it too. He stopped walking. He turned and looked back down the trail for a moment, then looked at Abigail with those dark, even eyes. "How many men does Marsh have?" she said before he could speak. "Enough," Ethan said. "Are they going to come up here?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Below them, the voices moved two men, she thought maybe three, somewhere on the lower switchback. "Marsh has been trying to buy grazing rights on my high pasture for 2 summers, Ethan said in a flat, considering tone. "I've told him no twice. He doesn't like that word much, does he?" Abigail looked at him. "No, he does not." Ethan looked back down the trail. Then he looked at Abigail. "You said you wanted work," he said. "I did." "Then walk," he said, "and keep up." He started up the trail again faster now, the pack horse moving with him, and Abigail Carter picked up her pace and followed the mountain cowboy up into the pines, and behind them, below them, Gerald Marsh's men called her name into the summer air, and the mountain swallowed the sound, and she did not look back. Not once. The ranch appeared at the crest of a long climbing ridge, set back from the tree line into a natural bowl that opened toward the east, which meant morning sun and afternoon shade. The logic of a man who understood his environment. The main house was built from timber and stone, not large but solid, the kind of structure that communicated permanence rather than comfort. A barn to the north. A corral where 5 horses moved in the early morning gold. A bunkhouse set slightly apart, its single window facing the mountain. It looked, Abigail thought, like a place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. She stood at the top of the ridge and looked at it, and the air up here was different, thinner, cleaner tasting of pine, and the particular cold edge that came off snowfields somewhere above. And for a moment, she felt the full weight of the last 24 hours land on her all at once. The boarding house. Pratt's apologetic face. Gerald Marsh standing across the street laughing with men who owed him something. The mountain trail in the dark. The fire. This man beside her who hadn't asked a single thing of her except whether she could keep up. She had $63.40, and the clothes in her bags, and a pair of boots with blood in the heel. She had never in her life felt so close to something that might be, if she was careful, and if she was brave, and if she didn't make the mistake of confusing gratitude with weakness, a beginning. "Bunkhouse is yours," Ethan said beside her. "There's water from the well, breakfast in an hour, and Miss Carter—" She looked at him. His face was serious and direct the way it had been all morning, but there was something in it now that she hadn't quite seen before. Something careful. Something that cost him something to say. "Whatever Marsh wants with you," he said. "He's going to have to come up this mountain to get it. And I've been on this mountain a long time." Abigail Carter looked at Ethan Walker for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Work well, and we'll call it even." He turned and walked toward the barn, and Abigail picked up her bags and walked toward the bunkhouse, and above them, both the Montana summer morning opened up wide and blue and enormous, and somewhere below in Caldwell Creek. Gerald Marsh was going to be told that his men had come up empty. She had one more thing to find out: whether Ethan Walker was the kind of man who meant what he said. She intended to find out the hard way, the only way she knew how: by working. Abigail Carter had made a promise to herself on that ridge. She would not ask for second chances. She would not explain herself. She would not wait for anyone to decide she was worth keeping around. She would work. And so she did. The first morning. Ethan said nothing about her blisters. He simply set a pair of worn work boots outside the bunkhouse door, before Dawn too large by half a size, stuffed with an extra pair of wool socks, and when she came out into the thin mountain air and found them there, she understood that this was how Ethan Walker communicated. Not with words. With things that needed doing quietly done. She put on the boots without comment. She showed up at the barn at the same time he did. He glanced at her feet, looked away. "Cattle need moving to the upper pasture today," he said. "Ever work a drive before?" "I've helped push horses from one paddock to another," Abigail said. "I imagine the principle's the same." "The principle is the same," Ethan said. "The cattle are not." He wasn't wrong. His herd was 37 head of mixed stock, mountain-bred and strong-willed. The kind of animals that had developed opinions from spending their lives on terrain that punished weakness. They did not respond the way paddock animals responded. They did not move politely. They cut sideways on steep ground-tested gaps in the line with the particular stubbornness of creatures that understood their own weight, and they had absolutely no interest in being managed by someone they hadn't decided to respect yet. Abigail spent the first hour of that drive being tested. The lead cow, a heavy-shouldered roan with a torn ear and the disposition of a woman who had been inconvenienced, one too many times, broke left on the second switchback with 3 others following her, and Abigail was on that side of the line, and she had to make a decision in about 2 seconds. She didn't wait for Ethan to call across to her. She turned her borrowed horse, cut the angle, and came up fast on the outside of the breakaway group before the roan could commit to the downhill. She came in close, crowding the animal's shoulder, and held her ground when the roan pushed back, and after a moment that felt much longer than it was, the roan turned. The other 3 followed. Abigail pushed them back into the line without looking at Ethan, from across the herd. After a beat, she heard him say quietly to no one in particular, She kept her eyes forward and allowed herself privately to feel satisfied. By midday, they had the cattle on the upper pasture, and Ethan pulled up his horse on the high ground and looked over the herd for a long moment, taking stock, counting heads, with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Then he looked at Abigail. "You ride better than you said," he told her. "I said my father raised horses," she said. "I didn't say I only watched." Something shifted in his expression. He looked back at the herd. "We've got fencing to check on the north side. Post's been working loose all summer." "Show me where," she said. He did. They worked the fence line through the long afternoon, Ethan pulling wire and Abigail driving posts with a maul that was built for a larger person. And she did not slow down, and she did not complain. And after a while, they fell into a rhythm that was almost like conversation without the words. She handed him wire before he reached for it. He steadied a post she was having trouble seating in the rocky ground without being asked. The work moved between them like something that had been practiced. On the ride back down to the ranch, the sun dropping behind the western peaks, Ethan said, "Where'd you learn to read a herd like that?" Abigail thought about it. My father used to say animals tell you what they're going to do before they do it. You just have to stop talking long enough to listen. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Smart man. He was, she said. The word landed between them in its past tense, and neither of them pursued it, and that was all right. Abigail had learned that grief like cattle had opinions about being pushed. It was the second day that the trouble started. She was at the well before breakfast when she heard the horses coming up the trail. Two riders moving at a pace that said they weren't in a hurry because they didn't think they needed to be. She recognized the lead horse. She recognized the man on it. A tall bay with a white blaze that belonged to a ranch hand named Cole DeWitt, who worked for Gerald Marsh's largest operation in the valley. DeWitt was a lean, weathered man in his 40s who had the particular ease of someone accustomed to delivering messages from powerful people. He rode into the yard like he owned it, which Abigail understood was the point. Ethan came out of the barn. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood. "Walker," DeWitt said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was technically polite and actually nothing of the kind. "DeWitt. Mr. Marsh wanted me to check in." DeWitt's eyes moved across the yard and found Abigail at the well and stayed there. "Word got back that you might have taken on some extra help." "Word gets around," Ethan said, his voice entirely flat. "Mr. Marsh has a concern." DeWitt brought his eyes back to Ethan. "The woman's got some matters pending in Caldwell Creek. Financial irregularities, I believe. Sheriff Purcell's looking into it." Abigail's hands tightened on the well handle. She said nothing. "That's so," Ethan said in a tone that gave DeWitt absolutely nothing. "Mr. Marsh thought you ought to know is all. Didn't want you getting caught up in something that ain't your business." Ethan took 2 steps forward. It wasn't a threatening move exactly. It was simply a deliberate one, the kind of step that closes distance on purpose and says, "I am not moving back from this ground. Abigail Carter works for me," he said. "That makes whatever concerns her my business. You tell Marsh that." DeWitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Abigail again, and there was something in that look, not quite a warning, not quite a threat, the particular look of a man delivering a message without saying it out loud. "Yes, sir," DeWitt said. He pulled his horse around. "Just passing along the word." They watched him ride back down the trail. When he was gone, Ethan turned and looked at Abigail. "Financial irregularities," she said before he could speak. "Gerald Marsh has a friend at the bank. He flagged my account for a supposed clerical error that doesn't exist. It's how he got my landlord to put me out." Ethan studied her. "Is there anything in it?" "No." He held her eyes for a moment. Then, "All right." Just that. "All right." He turned and went back into the barn, and Abigail stood at the well with her hands still around the handle, and the morning air moving cold through the yard, and she thought this man either trusts his own judgment completely, or he trusts something he's seen in me, and I don't know which it is yet, and I had better be worth whichever one it turns out to be. She went back to work. 3 days in one of the young ranch hands from the lower valley rode up to deliver supplies and found Abigail repairing the corral gate. He was maybe 19, freckled with the barely concealed amusement of a boy who thought he was looking at something funny. "You're the one Caldwell Creek's been talking about," he said. Abigail kept working the gate hinge. "Probably. They're saying Walker's lost his mind. People say a lot of things. They're saying a woman's got no business working cattle on the high pasture, that it ain't decent." He paused, apparently waiting for a reaction. "My ma thinks it's a shame." Abigail looked up at him then. "What do you think?" she said. The boy blinked. "Ma'am." "What do you think?" she repeated. "Not your mother, not Caldwell Creek. You. You've been standing there for 5 minutes watching me work. What do you think?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the gate. She was repairing a job that required holding 3 moving parts in alignment while simultaneously threading a bolt through hardware that had corroded half shut, and he clearly had no immediate answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that gate's been broken for a year and nobody's touched it." "That's right," Abigail said. She drove the bolt home. The boy didn't have anything else to say about it. He unloaded his supplies and left, and he went back down to the valley. And Abigail didn't know what he would tell people, and she found she cared considerably less about it than she would have a week ago. That night she ate supper in the main house for the first time. Ethan had not invited her exactly. He'd simply set 2 plates on the table when she came in from the barn, which she had understood as an invitation. They ate in the kind of silence that had become familiar, and it was not uncomfortable. And after a while Ethan said, "You fixed the corral gate." "It needed fixing," she said. "I know it needed fixing. I've been meaning to get to it." "I got to it first." A pause. "I noticed," he said. She looked up at him. There was something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. A warmth that moved briefly through those dark guarded eyes before he looked back down at his plate. It was the first time she'd seen anything like it, and it was so quickly gone that she might have doubted it, except that she was a woman who had spent 3 years reading rooms and faces, and the small movements of people deciding who they were going to be to her, and she had learned not to doubt what she saw. She ate her supper and said nothing about it. The first week became the second, and the second week changed things. Because by the end of 2 weeks, Abigail Carter knew Ethan Walker's operation, the way she knew the back of her own hand, and she had begun making small changes that she didn't announce and didn't ask about adjustments to the morning feed rotation. A different approach to the water trough distribution that cut the cattle's walking time in the upper pasture. A repair to the barn roof's north section that had been leaking silently into the hay store. Ethan noticed every one of them. He said nothing about them for 4 days. On the 5th day he said, "You changed the feed rotation." "The old rotation was costing you time in the mornings," she said. "The new one front-loads the heaviest work before the heat peaks." "I know why you changed it," he said. He wasn't irritated. He was simply precise. "I'm just noting that you changed it." "Is that a problem?" He looked at her steadily. "No." "Then why are you noting it?" A pause. And then Ethan Walker said something that told her more about him than anything else had so far. "Because," he said, "the last person who changed something on this ranch without asking was my wife. And she was right about that too." The word hung in the kitchen air between them. Wife. Past tense the same way she had said father. Abigail did not push it. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "The hay store's going to stay dry now. That section of roof was the last weak point." "I know," Ethan said. They finished breakfast. The second twist arrived on a Wednesday, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Margaret Hale. Margaret Hale was the wife of the largest landowner in the Caldwell Creek Valley, below a broad-faced, sharp-eyed woman, who wore her respectability the way some women wore jewelry visibly and with intention. She arrived on a good horse with a hired man trailing behind her, and she rode into Ethan's yard with the confidence of someone who believed her presence was a gift. Abigail was in the corral working a young horse through its paces. She saw Margaret's eyes find her, immediately assess her, and come to a conclusion all in about 3 seconds. "Mr. Walker," Margaret called, waiting for Ethan to come out of the barn. He came. "Mrs. Hale," he said with the flatness of a man who was being polite as a matter of form rather than enthusiasm. "I'll get right to the point," Margaret said, which was, Abigail thought, at least honest. "People in town are concerned about the situation here." Her eyes moved to Abigail in the corral, then back to Ethan. "A woman living on a man's ranch working alongside him without any proper arrangement." "She works for me," Ethan said. "That's the arrangement." "Ethan." Margaret's voice shifted softer, more private, the voice of someone deciding to be kind. "I knew your mother. I know the standards you were raised to. What you're doing isn't fair to this woman either. People are talking, and the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be for her reputation." "Her reputation," Ethan said, "was already destroyed by Gerald Marsh before she walked up this mountain. I didn't do that. I'm not doing that now." Margaret blinked. "Furthermore," Ethan said in that same flat, direct voice, "if the people of Caldwell Creek have opinions about how I run my ranch and who I employ, they are welcome to take those opinions, and—" He paused, and something moved behind his eyes, and he chose the milder ending, "keep them in Caldwell Creek." Margaret Hale stared at him. From the corral. Abigail kept working. The horse kept her face forward, but she heard every word, and something in her chest tightened, in a way she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implied debt, and this was not that. This was something quieter and more dangerous. This was feeling seen. Margaret regrouped. She turned her attention to Abigail crossing to the corral fence. "Miss Carter," she said with the particular warmth of a woman who had decided to try a different approach. "I'm sure you're a capable young woman, but you must understand what you're risking. This valley has a long memory. Let me speak to Reverend Collins. There are women in town who could use help, decent work, something that wouldn't." "I have decent work," Abigail said without breaking the horse's circle. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale. You can't honestly think staying up here is—" "I stayed at Caldwell Creek for 3 years," Abigail said, and now she did stop the horse, and she looked directly at Margaret Hale through the fence rails. "I was a good neighbor. I was a good customer. I kept my yard clean and my mouth clean, and I minded my business. None of that mattered when Gerald Marsh decided it wouldn't. So with respect, ma'am, I am considerably less interested in what Caldwell Creek thinks of my situation than I was 3 weeks ago." Margaret Hale was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and Abigail had the strange sense that the woman actually meant it, "Gerald Marsh is a dangerous man." "I know that," Abigail said. "He doesn't stop." "I know that too." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted some private recalibration, and she said very quietly, "No, I don't believe you're as foolish as to not know it." She pulled her eyes back to Ethan. "You'd better be careful, Walker." "Always am," Ethan said. Margaret Hale rode back down the mountain. When she was gone, Ethan came to the corral fence and leaned his arms on the top rail and watched the horse move. "You handled that well," he said. "She's not wrong about Marsh," Abigail said. "No," Ethan said. "She's not." A long pause. "He tried to buy my water rights 2 years ago," Ethan said. "Not my land, just the rights to the creek that runs through the upper pasture. Without water, you can't run cattle up here in summer. Without summer grazing, this ranch doesn't survive. I told him no." He paused. He found 3 different ways to pressure that no out of me. None of them worked. Abigail looked at him. "He's going to use me," she said. Not a question. "He's going to try," Ethan said. "Say I'm harboring a woman with legal troubles. Use it as leverage to get the county to look at my land use permissions. Find some irregularity, tie me up long enough that I miss the summer grazing window." He said it plainly without drama. "It's how he works." Abigail stood very still. "I could leave," she said. "I don't want to be the thing he uses against you." Ethan turned and looked at her directly, and there was something in his face that was both sharper and softer than anything she'd seen from him yet. "Miss Carter," he said, "you didn't bring Marsh into my life. He was already there. The only difference you've made is that now there are 2 of us who've told him no." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He pushed off the fence and went back to the barn, and Abigail worked the young horse through another half-hour of circles, and the mountain afternoon settled around the ranch with its usual indifference, and she thought about what it meant to have someone stand beside you, not because they owed you anything, not because they needed something from you, not because the math of obligation required it, but simply because they had decided that your no was worth defending. It was not a feeling she'd had in a very long time. She did not make the mistake of assuming what it meant. She made the mistake of hoping. The trouble broke open on a Thursday evening 3 weeks into her time on the mountain, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. One of Ethan's cattle, a yearling she'd privately named Trouble on account of his habit of testing every fence line on the upper pasture, had gotten himself down a rocky cut on the north side of the ridge, too steep for a horse and too narrow for an adult person to get down without significant effort. Ethan had found him at the end of a long day, wedged into the base of the cut, and had spent 20 minutes assessing the options, before concluding that the only approach was to go down after him. Abigail looked at the cut. She looked at the yearling. She looked at Ethan, who was 6 feet 2 and broad enough through the shoulders that the cut would have him wedged in solid before he got halfway down. "I'll go," she said. "No," Ethan said. "You won't fit," she said. I'll fit. Ethan. She said his name for the first time since she'd arrived, and something in him stilled in a way she noticed. You will not fit, and you know it. And that yearling is going to injure himself further if he's down there much longer. Let me go. He looked at her. He looked at the cut. He looked at her again, and she watched something move through him, a man working against his own instincts, which was not comfortable territory for someone built the way he was built. I'll hold the rope, he said finally. You clip it to the yearling's halter, and I'll pull him up. But if it gives way, you grab the rope. You understand me. You leave the animal, and you grab the rope. I understand, she said. Say it back to me. She met his eyes. If it gives way, I leave the animal, and I grab the rope. He held her eyes for one more second, long enough that she felt it as something other than assessment, and then he tied the rope around her waist, and she went down. It was harder than it looked. The rock was dry but crumbling, and the angle was steeper than it had appeared from the top. And by the time she reached the yearling, she was breathing hard, and her hands were cut in 2 places, and the animal was less than thrilled about being approached from above by a human being coming down a rock face. She talked to him. Not words exactly the same. Low, steady sound her father had used with horses, the vocal equivalent of keeping your movements slow and your intentions clear. The yearling's ears flicked. His breathing changed. She got her hand on his halter, and he pushed against her, and she braced against the rock and held. Ready, she called up. From above, the rope went taut. What happened next happened fast. The yearling came up in a series of lurching, half-panicked scrambles, and on the 3rd scramble, his back leg caught in a crack in the rock, and he twisted, and his weight came backward, and for one very clear moment, Abigail was holding a terrified animal and an uncooperative rope, and a rock face that was giving way under her right boot. She let go of the halter. She grabbed the rope. Above her, Ethan pulled. She came up the rock face with her boots, finding purchase where they could, and her hands burning on the rope, and the yearling somehow scrambled up under his own power in the same moment, and they all 3 ended up on the flat ground at the top in a tangled, breathing, undignified heap. The yearling bolted immediately toward the herd. Ethan was on one knee beside her, his hands on her arms. You hurt, he said. No, she said. She looked at her hands. Yes, but not seriously. He looked at the cuts on her palms, and his expression did something she couldn't name, tightened in a way that wasn't anger exactly, something older and more private than anger. Come up to the house, he said. I've got carbolic. I'll manage. Abigail. Her name in his voice. Again that stillness in the air between them. Let someone help you. You don't always have to manage alone. She looked at him. I was closer than he'd been before. Both of them still breathing hard from the effort and the fear of the last few minutes. And she could see the dust on his face, and the concern that he hadn't quite managed to put back behind that dark, even expression. And she thought, he is a careful man, a private man, a man who has chosen his solitude deliberately and not out of laziness, and he is offering something right now, even if neither of us is naming what it is. All right, she said. He helped her to her feet. He did not let go of her arm immediately, and she did not pull away immediately, and they stood together on the high ground for just a moment longer than was required, and then they walked back down towards the house in the cooling mountain evening. Inside at the kitchen table, Ethan cleaned her cuts with the focused care of someone who knew what he was doing and was using the task as something to hold on to. She watched his hands. Careful, precise, unhurried. You've done this before, she said. Mountain work has a learning curve, he said. I didn't mean the cuts, she said very quietly. His hands stilled. She hadn't meant to say it. It had simply come out the way true things sometimes did when a person's guard had been lowered by adrenaline and pain, and the particular vulnerability of sitting in someone's kitchen at the end of a hard day. Ethan didn't look up for a moment. Then he did. No, he said. I haven't. A pause. Not for a long time. The lamp on the table between them. His hands still around hers, neither of them moving. From outside, the sound of the mountain settling into night wind in the pines. Cattle distant in the upper pasture, something ordinary and immense. Then Ethan sat back. He capped the carbolic. He said, I'll get supper on. I'll help, Abigail said. Your hands. I can stir a pot, she said. He looked at her, and that thing moved through his eyes again, that warmth he kept pulling back before it reached the surface, and he said very simply, "All right." They made supper together in the mountain kitchen, and outside the valley went dark. And in Caldwell Creek below, a man named Gerald Marsh was reading a letter from his lawyer, and the letter contained 3 words that made him set down his glass very slowly on his desk. Water rights application. Someone had beaten him to the county filing office. Someone had filed a formal water rights claim on the upper pasture creek 48 hours before his own application was due to be submitted. Marsh read the applicant's name, and he picked up the glass again, set it back down, picked up his pen. He was done being patient. Gerald Marsh did not do his own dirty work. That was the first thing Abigail had learned about him in Caldwell Creek, and it was the thing she should have remembered when the week after the water rights filing passed without incident. The quiet wasn't peace. It was a man deciding how hard to hit and where. The answer came on a Monday. Sheriff Dale Purcell rode up the mountain trail with a deputy and a piece of paper and the expression of a man who had told himself he was only doing his job so many times that he'd almost started to believe it. He was a thin, precise man in his 50s who had held the sheriff's position in Caldwell Creek for 11 years and understood with the clarity of long experience exactly who kept him in it. Ethan came out of the barn when he heard the horses. Abigail was at the water trough. She stayed where she was. "Walker," Purcell said, touching his hat. He held the paper out. "County Court Order. Formal inquiry into the water rights application filed on the upper pasture creek. There's an allegation of fraudulent filing." Ethan took the paper. He read it without any visible change in his expression. "Fraudulent how?" he said. "Allegation is the application was filed using land survey data that doesn't match county records," Purcell said. He sounded tired. Not apologetic. Purcell was not a man who did apologetic, but tired in the way of someone who knew the machinery he was running and didn't love the sound of it anymore. "You'll need to appear before Judge Calhoun in Caldwell Creek on Friday. Bring your deed and any survey documentation you have." "The survey data is correct," Ethan said. "Then you'll have no trouble showing that on Friday," Purcell said. He started to turn his horse. Then he stopped. He looked at Abigail. "Miss Carter," he said, and his voice was different now, lower, careful. "There's also a warrant for your appearance, regarding the bank account irregularity." Abigail felt the words land in her chest, like something with weight. She'd known it was coming. Knowing didn't make it lighter. "On whose complaint?" she said. "Orrin Stokes on behalf of the Caldwell Creek Bank." "Orrin Stokes doesn't take a step without Gerald Marsh's permission," she said. Purcell held her eyes for a moment. Something moved across his face just briefly, just enough to see, and then he put it away. "Friday," he said. 9 o'clock. He rode away. Ethan stood with the court paper in his hand and watched him go. Then he turned and looked at Abigail, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because there wasn't anything to say that the situation hadn't already said plainly. "He's moving faster than I expected," Ethan said. "He's scared of that water rights filing," Abigail said. "He should be." She looked at him. "I need to know something." "Ask it." "The survey data," she said. "Is it correct?" Ethan held her eyes. "Every line of it." "Then who filed it?" A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not evasion exactly, but the look of a man deciding how much to say and in what order. "I did," he said. 2 weeks ago. Day after DeWitt came up here with Marsh's message." Abigail stared at him. "You filed for the water rights the day after his man came to warn you off," she said. "I'd been meaning to file for 2 years," Ethan said. "Marsh showing up reminded me I was running out of time to mean it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "He's going to come after this ranch with everything he has now. I know that. And me being here makes it worse. Miss Carter." Ethan's voice was quiet but absolute. "You being here didn't create this. He's wanted my water rights since before you ever set foot in Caldwell Creek. Now." He folded the court paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "We've got 4 days before Friday, and a cattle count that needs finishing, and a fence line on the south ridge that's been giving trouble since last week. Are we going to stand here talking about Gerald Marsh, or are we going to work? She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "We're going to work." They worked. But the mountain had its own timeline, and it didn't consult anyone's plans. The first sign was the smell. Something sharp and dry on the wind that came down from the upper ridgeline on Tuesday evening. The smell of heat pressed against tinder. The smell of a summer that had been too long and too hot and too airless, finding its ending point. Ethan stopped what he was doing when it hit him. He stood in the yard and lifted his face and read the wind the way men do when they've lived long enough in wild country to know that smell is a language. "Where?" Abigail said, coming out of the barn. "North Ridge," he said. "Above the tree line. Lightning strike from last week's dry storm most likely. It's been smoldering." She looked at the sky. The light had gone strange in the north, a yellowish tint that wasn't sunset, a haziness that wasn't weather. "How fast?" she said. "Depends on the wind," he said. "And the wind's picking up." He moved. She moved with him. They didn't discuss the plan because the plan was obvious, and they both knew it'd get the cattle off the upper pasture before the fire reached the dry grass above the tree line and turned a smolder into a run. 37 head on high ground with fire above them was not a situation that allowed for deliberation. Ethan saddled 2 horses in 4 minutes. Abigail had the corral gate open and the pack gear sorted before he was done. They rode up the mountain trail at a pace that was below reckless and above sensible, and the smell of smoke thickened as they climbed, and the light in the north went from yellow to a dull, ugly orange. They hit the upper pasture to find the herd already restless. Cattle knew fire long before people did, had some ancient instinct for it that bypassed thinking entirely and went straight to muscle and blood. The animals were bunched and moving in tight, unhappy circles, and the lead roan with the torn ear was at the edge of the group facing North Ears Flat, which told Ethan everything about which direction the fire was moving. "Split them," he said. "You take the east side, push them south. Don't let the roan break north or the whole herd follows her." "Got it," Abigail said, and she was already moving. What came next was the hardest 30 minutes of work she had done on the mountain. And it was also, she would think about this later, much later in the quiet, the most completely alive she had felt in years. There was no room for anything but the task. No room for Gerald Marsh or court orders or what Caldwell Creek thought of her, or what she was afraid of, or what she hoped for. There was only the herd and the fire smell getting stronger, and the smoke now visible above the north tree line in thick rolling columns, and 37 animals that needed to move south and did not want to. The roan broke north on the second push. Abigail cut her off. The horse beneath her was faster than she'd expected. Ethan's second best, she'd learned a gray quarter horse named Smoke, who had opinions about terrain the same way Ethan did, and they came in hard on the roan's left shoulder, and the animal balked and spun, and Abigail held the line. Held it pushed back against 1,500 pounds of frightened cattle with nothing but will and position, and a horse that trusted her to know what she was doing. The roan turned. The herd followed. They pushed the cattle down the mountain in a long controlled run that was only barely controlled the smoke above them now, and the wind carrying heat on it. And Ethan worked the west flank, and Abigail worked the east, and they communicated in the wordless way they'd been developing for 3 weeks. A lifted hand. A glance, a shift in position that said, "I see what you see, and I've got my side." And they brought the herd down off the upper pasture and through the ridge gate and into the lower field without losing a single animal. Ethan closed the gate. He stood there for a moment with his hand briefly touching the wood, and it was the most private thing Abigail had ever seen him do. Just that 1 second of letting the weight of it show before he straightened and turned. Their eyes met across the gate. No words, just that. Then Ethan said, "I need to ride back up and check the north fence line. If the fire jumps the ridge, it'll come down through the timber and—" "I'm coming," she said. "No. Ethan. One of us needs to stay with the herd," he said. "They're spooked. They run, we lose them in the lower valley. I need you here." She hated that he was right. "You go to the ridge line," she said. "You do not go past it. If the fire's moving fast, you come back." He looked at her with that dark, direct gaze. "You're giving me orders," he said. and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same house. "I'm giving you information," she said. "What you do with it is your business." Something crossed his face. Then he swung up onto his horse and rode back up the trail, and Abigail turned to the restless herd and began the slow, deliberate work of calming 37 frightened animals, talking to them in that low, steady voice her father had taught her, walking the fence line at the edge of the field, being a presence that said, "Everything is all right, and I am here and you do not need to run." She was good at it. She had been doing it her whole life, calming frightened things, being the still point. She was very tired of needing to be the still point. Ethan was back in an hour. The fire had burned itself to the ridgeline and stalled there. The rocky escarpment above the timber had given it nowhere to go, and the wind had shifted just enough to push it east along the bare rock rather than down through the trees. Close, but contained. "It's out of the timber," he said. "Grass on the upper pasture is burned, but the fence line held." Abigail let out a breath that had been in her chest for an hour. Ethan dismounted. He stood beside her at the fence, looking at the herd, and the evening had gone fully dark now, the smoke smell still on the air, but lighter, and the cattle had quieted. "You handled them well," he said. "They're good animals," she said. A pause. Then Ethan said very quietly, "You didn't panic." She looked at him. "Did you expect me to?" "No," he said, something careful in his voice. "That's not what I meant." She waited. "My wife panicked," he said. "Not about cattle, about other things, hard things. She panicked and I didn't know how to help her and I—" He stopped, looked at the cattle. "I wasn't good at that, at knowing what someone needed when they were frightened." The night air between them, the smoke, the distant sound of the herd settling. "What happened to her?" Abigail said. Not unkindly, the way you'd say it to someone who had been carrying something a long time and you thought might be ready to set it down. Ethan was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Fever. Same winter my son was born." He paused. "He didn't make it either. The baby." The words fell into the dark and stayed there. Abigail didn't reach for anything immediate to say. She'd learned by then that Ethan Walker was not a man who needed his grief, explained back to him, and she wasn't a woman who covered hard things with soft noise. So she stood with him in the quiet and let what he'd said be what it was. After a while she said, "I'm sorry. 6 years ago," he said. "I don't say that so I just—" He stopped again. "I say it because you asked, and because you're the first person I've told in a long time who I think actually wanted to know the answer." She looked at him, then full on. He was looking back. "I wasn't a good husband," he said. "Not because I didn't care, because I didn't—" He searched for the word, "see her." Not the way she needed. "I was good at work, and I was good at this land, and I was not good at looking up from it often enough." "You're looking up now," Abigail said. He held her gaze. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Yeah," he said. "I am." The air between them held something that neither of them named, because neither of them was the kind of person who named things before they were sure, and they were not yet sure, and the court date was Friday, and Gerald Marsh was below them in the valley, picking up his pen, and the mountain had just tried to burn, and this was not, Abigail told herself, this was not the moment for anything except honesty. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I'm afraid," she said. "Not of Marsh, not of the court date. I'm afraid that I'm—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "That I'm building something here that I don't have the right to build. That I'm making a home out of a job, and that's not fair to you." Ethan was very still. "Who told you that you don't have the right?" he said. "Nobody had to tell me. I can see the math of it." "What math?" "I came up this mountain with $63 and bleeding boots," she said. "I asked for work. You gave it. That's the whole of what I'm entitled to, and I know it, and I don't want to." Abigail. Her name in his voice the way he'd used it twice before, and each time it had stopped the air. "I hired a worker. I know that. But I have been alone on this mountain for 6 years, and I have never once looked forward to breakfast until 3 weeks ago." The simplicity of it hit her somewhere below her ribs. "That's not—" she started. I know what it is, he said. And I know what it isn't. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm just telling you what's true, so that you don't make decisions based on a math problem that's got the wrong numbers in it. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood there a moment longer. Then Ethan said, There's something else. She heard it in his voice, the shift in register that meant they were leaving one hard conversation and entering another. Marsh didn't just file the complaint about the water rights survey, Ethan said. I got a message today from my lawyer in Helena. Marsh has also contacted the Territorial Land Office. He's claiming my original homestead deed has an error in the boundary description. If he can make that stick, he can push for a formal resurvey. And a resurvey takes months. And if my operation is under a land dispute during the summer grazing season, you lose the season, Abigail said. And the season pays the year, he said. She stood very still. He's not coming after me, she said. Not really. He's using me to come after you. He was already coming after me, Ethan said. You're just the excuse that finally felt convenient. She looked at the dark mountain above them, the smoke smell, the contained fire on the north ridge. What does your lawyer say? She said. He says the deed is clean. He also says Marsh has enough money to make clean things look dirty for long enough to matter. And the water rights application. He says the survey data is correct and provable. He also says a county judge who owes Marsh favors might choose to interpret provable differently than a dictionary would. Abigail thought about this. Judge Calhoun, she said. What kind of man is he? Careful man, Ethan said. Not corrupt exactly, careful. He does what's legal unless doing what's legal costs him too much. Then we make it cost Marsh more than it costs Calhoun, she said. Ethan looked at her. How? Friday, she said. The court appearance. Is it public? Formal inquiry. Anyone can attend. Then we make sure people attend, she said. Not to cause trouble, to witness. Marsh works best in private in back offices and quiet conversations where nobody's watching. He doesn't like daylight. Ethan studied her. You're thinking about Margaret Hale. I'm thinking about every person in that valley who's told Marsh no at some point and been quietly squeezed for it afterward, she said. They're all afraid individually. But if they're all in that courtroom on Friday, he can't threaten all of them at once, Ethan said. Not visibly, she said. And Marsh is a man who cares about how things look. A long silence. That's not a bad plan, Ethan said. It's not a perfect one either, she said. But it's what we have. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her a long, direct look and said, How do you know how men like Marsh work? The question landed on an old bruise and she felt it. Because I married the opposite of him, she said. And then I watched what happened when someone like Marsh decided a person like Thomas was in his way. She paused. The man who lost Thomas's school position in our last town. Different name, same type. They're all the same type. Ethan said nothing, just looked at her with those dark eyes that had stopped pretending not to hold things a long time ago. I'm sorry, he said. The same words she'd given him. I know, she said, the same answer. They stood together on the fence line in the smoke-touched dark, two people who had been broken by different losses, and rebuilt themselves into something that had forgotten briefly how to want things, and were now with some alarm and more hope than either of them was ready to say plainly remembering. Then the sound came from the lower trail. Horses. Multiple. Moving fast and not trying to be quiet about it, which was the particular statement of men who wanted to be heard before they arrived. Ethan straightened. 3 riders came into the yard from the trail, and the one in front was Cole DeWitt. And beside him was a man Abigail didn't recognize, broad and pale, and holding himself with the deliberate calm of someone hired to be calm on other people's behalf. And behind them both on a dark horse that cost more than most men in the valley earned in a year was Gerald Marsh. He had come himself. Abigail felt something cold move through her that wasn't fear exactly. It was older than fear. It was the particular recognition of a woman who has watched a powerful man decide to stop using other people to deliver his messages. Ethan stepped forward, not rushing, just closing distance with that same deliberate intention she'd seen the first time DeWitt came into the yard. "Marsh," he said. Marsh dismounted. He was older than she'd remembered, or rather she was seeing him now in a different light without the social architecture of Caldwell Creek around him, without the hotel lobby and the men who laughed at his jokes and the deference that surrounded him like a second skin. Up here on the mountain in the smoke-tinged dark, he was just a man in expensive clothes who had ridden a long way to make a point. "Walker," he said. He didn't look at Abigail immediately, which told her he was aware of her precisely. "Nice night for a fire." "Lightning strike," Ethan said. "Happens." "Lucky it didn't take the ranch," Marsh said pleasantly. The threat was so naked that it sat there in the air between all of them, like something physical. Ethan said, "What do you want, Marsh?" "I want to save us all a trip to town on Friday," Marsh said. Simple conversation, man to man. Now he looked at Abigail for the first time directly, and his voice didn't change at all. "Though I see we have company." "Miss Carter works for me," Ethan said. "Yes," Marsh said. "That's the conversation." He took 2 steps closer. He was a man who understood the geometry of space and power, who used physical approach the same way other men used volume. "I have no interest in ruining you, Walker. I never have. I want the water rights to that upper creek. I have since before you filed, and we both know it. We could have made an arrangement 2 years ago that would have benefited us both. You offered me 12% of the water's commercial value," Ethan said, "for permanent rights." 15, Marsh said. "I'm prepared to go to 20 today, and to make the bank complaint and the survey challenge disappear by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Silence. 20% was more than nothing. Abigail knew that Ethan knew it. "And Miss Carter's situation," Ethan said. Marsh smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had come to the part of the conversation he had prepared for. "Miss Carter is a woman with a complicated history and limited options," he said. "If she were to find a more suitable situation elsewhere, the bank matter would resolve itself. Clean record. Fresh start." He said it like a kindness. Abigail felt the blood in her face go hot. She stepped forward. Ethan moved at the same instant, not blocking her, not stopping her, just moving to stand beside her, shoulder parallel, and that single movement said everything it needed to say about where he stood. "Get off my land," Abigail said, and her voice was so steady that it surprised even her. "You came up this mountain to offer me a fresh start, like you didn't steal the one I already had. You took my home and my account and my standing in that town, and you did it because I told you no, and I am telling you no again. Right now, on this man's land in front of his face for the last time. No." Marsh looked at her. For one long moment, the mask of pleasantness he wore, like a coat, came entirely off, and she saw what was underneath it. Something cold and calculating, and entirely without mercy. And then it came back, and he was smiling again, and he said very quietly, "Miss Carter, you have no idea what kind of trouble you're choosing." "Neither do you," Ethan said. Marsh looked at him. "You show up to that courthouse on Friday," Ethan said, "with your bought judge and your bank manager and your land office friends, and you're going to find it's a crowded room. Because I've spent 6 years on this mountain keeping my head down and my business clean, and I know every rancher in this valley who's tried to do the same thing and had your hand in their pocket for it. And they're going to be in that room, every single one of them, because I asked them, yesterday." Something shifted in Marsh's face. Just briefly. Just enough. He had not expected that. "Friday then," he said. He turned back to his horse. DeWitt and the other man followed his lead, and for a moment the yard was full of the sound and movement of departure horses, turning boots in the stirrups, leather creaking. Then Marsh paused. He looked back once. "The fire on the North Ridge," he said pleasantly. "Terrible luck. These summer droughts." He paused. "Hope your luck holds, Walker." He rode away down the trail. Ethan stood in the yard and watched him go, and beside him Abigail stood and watched too, and neither of them moved until the sound of hooves faded completely and the mountain got its quiet back. Then Ethan said, "I lied." She looked at him. "I haven't contacted anyone yet," he said. "I said it to see how he'd react." Abigail stared at him. Then she said, "Can you actually contact them, the other ranchers?" "Some of them," Ethan said. Maybe enough. How much time do we have? 2 days, he said. She looked at him. Then we'd better start writing, she said. Ethan looked back at her, and in his face was something she had never seen there before. Not warmth, exactly. Not that careful thing he usually pulled back before it reached the surface, but something wider than that. Something that looked like two people who had decided to stop being alone. Yeah, he said. We'd better. They wrote letters until past midnight. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pen that needed refilling twice, and Abigail sat across from him with the lamp between them and a list of names he dictated from memory ranchers, small landowners. One feed store operator, a widow, who ran 40 head on her late husband's property 2 valleys over. People who had built things in this territory through hard work and kept them through harder work, and who had at some point in the last 5 years felt Gerald Marsh's hand pressing on something they owned. Ethan wrote the letters. Abigail addressed the envelopes. They did not talk much. They didn't need to. At one point she said, "How many of these people will actually come?" Ethan didn't look up from the letter he was finishing. "Some of them," he said. "Enough, maybe." "And if it's not enough," he set down the pen. He looked at her directly. "Then we lose the water rights, and I spend the next year in a legal dispute about my deed, and Marsh gets what he's been reaching for. And you," he paused, "you are right back to where you were before you walked up this mountain, except with a worse situation and a smaller bank account." The honesty of it sat between them. "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I'm saying it anyway, because you have the right to know exactly what you're standing in the middle of before Friday." She looked at the stack of addressed envelopes between them. "I made my choice when I told him no in your yard last night," she said. "I'm not reversing it." Something in Ethan's face settled the particular settling of a man who had asked a hard question and gotten the answer he needed, not the answer he wanted, which was a different and more trustworthy thing. "All right," he said, and picked up the pen. They finished the letters at midnight. Ethan rode down the mountain trail at first light with the envelopes in his saddlebag, hitting every neighbor within riding distance, leaving letters for those too far to reach personally. He was back by noon. He said nothing about which doors had opened and which had stayed closed, and she didn't ask, and the afternoon was spent on ordinary work because the cattle did not care about court dates. Thursday passed like a held breath. That evening, Margaret Hale's hired man rode up the trail with a note that said, "Only, we will be there. M.H." Ethan read it and handed it to Abigail without comment. She read it and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, the way you'd look at something small that turned out to weigh more than you expected. "She came around," Abigail said. "She's a practical woman," Ethan said. "Marsh has been pressing on the Hale grazing lease for 18 months. She knows which way this goes if he wins Friday." "It's still something," Abigail said. "People doing the right thing even when it's practical doesn't make it less right." He looked at her across the table. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They ate supper. They talked about the south fence and the cattle count and the condition of the hay store after the smoke. And they talked around the thing that was sitting between them, the way it had been sitting since the night on the fence line, and neither of them reached for it directly because Friday was tomorrow, and there was no wisdom in starting something with a court date in the morning. But when Abigail stood to clear the plates, Ethan said, "Whatever happens tomorrow." She stopped. "I want you to know," he said, and he was choosing words the way he chose everything carefully with full awareness of their weight, "that what you've done here, these 4 weeks, it mattered. Whatever the court says, whatever Marsh does, this ranch has been more itself with you on it than it's been in 6 years, and He stopped. His jaw moved. "I just wanted to say that. Before tomorrow." She stood with the plates in her hands and looked at this man who had let her in out of the dark and given her work and stood beside her in a yard with Marsh's horses in it and hadn't once asked her to be smaller or quieter or more manageable than she was. "Thank you," she said, "for not sending me back down that mountain." "Thank you," he said, "for not going." She took the plates to the wash basin. She went to the bunkhouse. She lay in the dark and listened to the mountain and did not sleep for a very long time. Friday came gray and warm, the kind of summer morning that promised heat before noon. They rode down the mountain together in the early light. Abigail in the better of her two dresses. The blue one, the one she'd packed first, because it had been Thomas's favorite, though she didn't say that, and Ethan in a clean shirt with his hat brushed, and his boots in better condition than usual. He'd done that quietly the way he did everything. The road into Caldwell Creek was empty at first. Then at the fork where the mountain trail joined the main valley road, they weren't alone. 2 riders fell in from the east, then 3 more from the south. A wagon from the direction of the Hale property, and in it, Margaret Hale in her good coat, sitting straight-backed, with 2 of her ranch hands beside her. The widow Jessup on her brown mare, riding alone, her face set with the particular expression of a woman who had made up her mind and wasn't reconsidering. Ed Calloway from the feed store on a mule that moved at its own pace, regardless of anyone's urgency. By the time Caldwell Creek's main street was visible ahead, there were 19 people riding behind Ethan Walker and Abigail Carter. Not a crowd, but not nothing. Abigail felt something in her throat tighten, and she looked straight ahead, and she did not let it show. Ethan rode beside her without comment, but she saw his hand relax on the reins. The county courthouse was a squared-off building at the end of Caldwell Creek's main street, 2 stories of brick and federal intention, in a town that was otherwise mostly timber. Judge Calhoun held formal inquiries in the ground floor hearing room on the 2nd and 4th Friday of each month, and the room held 30 people comfortably, and perhaps 40 if nobody objected to proximity. By 8:45, it held 38. Abigail was aware of the shift the moment they walked in, the way the room reorganized itself around their arrival. People who had been standing in neutral clusters, moving with the subtle magnetism of allegiance, some toward them and some away. She recognized faces from 3 years in Caldwell Creek. Some of them held her eyes. Some looked away. She noted both without expression. Gerald Marsh was already there. He sat at the respondent's table with his lawyer, a well-dressed man from Helena named Aldrich, who had the particular smoothness of someone who spent his life in rooms where money talked and everything else listened. Marsh himself was composed, his coat immaculate, and he watched Ethan and Abigail enter with the expression of a man reading a situation and adjusting to it. She saw the adjustment happen. She saw his eyes move over the people behind them. She saw the calculation occur, and whatever number it produced, she saw that it was not the number he had expected. Good, she thought. Ethan's lawyer was a younger man named Garrett out of Helena, who had ridden through the night to be there and showed it in the state of his coat, but not in the state of his mind. He met them at the door with a handshake and 3 minutes of rapid, quiet summary. The survey data was solid. The documentation was in order. The bank complaint against Abigail was the thinner piece dependent entirely on Orrin Stokes's testimony. And Orrin Stokes was a man, Garrett said, with a number of his own financial irregularities that had not yet been introduced into any official proceeding, but could be. Is that a threat? Abigail asked. It's a fact, Garrett said. Facts aren't threats, they're just facts that haven't been spoken yet. She liked him immediately. Judge Calhoun arrived at 9 o'clock precisely. He was a compact, gray-haired man who moved with the economy of someone who had stopped tolerating wasted motion a long time ago. He took his seat, looked at the room taking in. Abigail thought the number of people in it and their arrangement, and opened his record book. We're here on 2 matters, he said. First, the formal challenge to the water rights application filed by Ethan Walker on behalf of the Walker Mountain Ranch. Second, the bank irregularity complaint filed by Orrin Stokes against one Abigail Carter, formerly of this town. He looked up over his glasses. Mr. Aldrich, you filed the challenge. Present your basis. Aldrich stood with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd been in more courtrooms than Abigail had eaten hot meals. Your Honor, the application filed by Mr. Walker relies upon a property survey conducted by a J.T. Merrick in the spring of this year. We have reason to believe the survey data misrepresents the creek's boundary position by a material margin, which would affect the validity of the claim. What reason? Calhoun said. We have commissioned an independent assessment. From whom? Garrett said from his seat. Calhoun looked at him. You'll have your turn, Counselor. Your Honor, Garrett said, standing. I'd respectfully ask that the source of the independent assessment be identified before we proceed, as the independence of that assessment is directly relevant to its credibility." Calhoun considered this for exactly 2 seconds. "Mr. Aldrich, who commissioned your assessment?" Aldrich's composure did not crack. It simply shifted. A minor adjustment quickly corrected. "The assessment was commissioned by my client, Mr. Gerald Marsh, who has a prior interest in the water rights in question." "So the independent assessment," Calhoun said in a tone that was perfectly neutral and somehow devastating, "was commissioned by the party challenging the original application. That is technically—" "Thank you, Mr. Aldrich." Calhoun looked at Garrett. "Mr. Garrett, your surveyor." Garrett presented J.T. Merrick's documentation, 30 pages of it precise and dated and cross-referenced with county records going back to the original homestead filing. Merrick himself was not present, but his certification was notarized by 2 county officials who were not connected to Marsh's interests, and the methodology was clear and reproducible and showed exactly what it showed. The water rights application was valid. Marsh's lawyer argued for 20 minutes. He argued well. Abigail gave him that he was a genuinely skilled man, working with a genuinely weak case, and he knew the difference, even if his client didn't. When he sat down, he set his pen on the table with a quietness that said he knew how this was going. Judge Calhoun looked at the documentation for a long moment. The room was absolutely silent. Then he said, "The challenge to the Walker Mountain Ranch water rights application is dismissed. The application stands. Mr. Walker's claim is confirmed." 19 people behind Ethan Walker made no sound. They didn't need to. Marsh's face did not move. "Second matter," Calhoun said. "Mr. Stokes." Orrin Stokes was a small man who had always seemed larger in his own bank than he did outside it. He stood up at Aldrich's nod and straightened his coat and said in the precise, careful voice of someone reciting, rather than testifying, that there had been an irregularity in the account of one Abigail Carter, an amount of $14 unaccounted for in the quarterly reconciliation, and that the bank had a responsibility to Mr. Stokes, Calhoun said. $14. "Yes, Your Honor." "You brought this to a formal inquiry over $14. Stokes's collar appeared to tighten of its own accord. "The bank has a responsibility to Mr. Garrett," Calhoun said. Response. Garrett stood. "Your Honor, we have a complete record of Miss Carter's transactions at the Caldwell Creek Bank, going back to the date of her account's opening. The supposed irregularity is a bookkeeping entry error on the bank's side, documented in the bank's own quarterly correction log." He placed 3 pages on the bench. "Furthermore, we would note that the complaint was filed 7 days after Miss Carter declined a personal proposal from Mr. Gerald Marsh, and 2 days after she left Caldwell Creek. The timing is noted for the court's consideration." The room shifted. Not loudly. A breath. A repositioning. The sound of people understanding something they'd suspected becoming something they'd witnessed. Calhoun looked at the pages. Looked at Stokes. "Is the correction log entry accurate at Mr. Stokes?" Stokes was the color of old chalk. "I would need to review." "You're the bank manager," Calhoun said. "Is the entry accurate?" A silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Yes," Stokes said very quietly. "Complaint dismissed," Calhoun said. He didn't reach for any particular gravity. He just said it, turned the page of his record book and moved on. That was it. $14 and 3 years of Abigail Carter's life and Gerald Marsh's patience. All of it dismissed in 4 words by a gray-haired judge who had looked at the room full of people and done the math. She didn't cry. She had known she wouldn't. She sat very straight and she breathed carefully, and beside her, Ethan's hand moved under the table and found hers, and he held it, not a gesture, not a statement, just a hand, holding a hand, and she let him, and that was that. Marsh was already on his feet. He was not a man who made scenes. He was a man who filed things, and maneuvered and waited, and he understood that today's room was not his room, and he moved through it with his lawyer close, and his face arranged into something that looked almost like pleasant neutrality, and Abigail watched him come toward the door where she and Ethan were standing. He stopped. He looked at Abigail. "You've won a day," he said very quietly. "Just for them. Not a war," Ethan said in an equally quiet voice. "You came up my mountain last Tuesday and made a threat about a wildfire marsh. I noted the exact words. So did Miss Carter. And so did my lawyer, who I told about it Wednesday morning." He held Marsh's eyes. "A man who's been making land moves in this territory for 15 years, and a specific fire threat 48 hours before a court date. That's a pattern a territorial marshal might find interesting." Marsh's face did not change, but something behind it did. "Good day," Ethan said. Marsh walked out. For a moment after he left, Abigail stood absolutely still and felt the full weight of the last 5 weeks settle through her. The boarding house, the main street, the mountain trail in the dark, the fire, the letters written past midnight, this room, this moment. And she thought about her mother's voice saying dignity was something you kept inside where nobody could touch it. And she thought, yes, Mama, that's right. But it's also something that other people can see even when you can't. And sometimes that's how you find it again. Margaret Hale appeared at her elbow. "Miss Carter," she said. She was a different woman than the one who'd ridden up the mountain with gentle warnings about propriety. Or perhaps she was the same woman, just standing differently. "I owe you an apology. When I came to Walker's Ranch, I came because I thought I was protecting you. I was actually asking you to make yourself smaller so that the rest of us wouldn't have to be uncomfortable." Abigail looked at her. "I accept your apology," she said. Margaret nodded. Then, in a different voice, she said, "Where do you plan to go from here?" Abigail glanced at Ethan, who was talking with Garrett and 2 of the ranchers. His hand gestures carrying the particular economy of a man wrapping up a concluded argument and moving forward. "Back up the mountain," she said. "The south fence still needs work." Something moved across Margaret Hale's face, understanding maybe, and something warmer than that, and she said, "Good." The ride back up the mountain was not quiet because there were people riding part of the way with them. The Hale wagon and the widow Jessup and Ed Calloway, all heading north before they peeled off at their respective trails, and there was the loose, warm talk of people who had done a hard thing together and come out the other side. Ed Calloway told a long story about a dispute with a neighbor over a fence line that had been resolved by a county surveyor and a very old dog, and Abigail found herself laughing at the end of it, genuinely and fully the kind of laugh that surprised you because you'd forgotten it was still in you. Ethan rode beside her, not talking much occasionally, adding a word to the general conversation. But once, when Calloway was mid-story and the others were laughing, she felt Ethan's eyes on the side of her face, and she turned and he looked at her with that thing fully visible for the first time, not pulled back, not managed, just there. And then he looked at the road ahead again, and she looked at the road ahead again, and neither of them said anything about it. By the time they were back on the mountain trail, and the last of the other riders had turned off, the afternoon was full, and the sky above the pines was a hard bright blue, and the smoke smell from Tuesday's fire was almost entirely gone. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Abigail said, "Marsh isn't done." "No," Ethan said. "He'll find another way to push." "He'll try," Ethan said. "But today changes the math. He needed the water rights to make this range unworkable. He doesn't have them. He needed the bank complaint to make you a liability. He doesn't have that either. He's not out of moves, but the moves he has left are more expensive than they were yesterday." And the fire threat. "Garrett is writing to the territorial marshal's office today," Ethan said. "It may come to nothing, but Marsh knows the letter is being written, and that means he knows someone official has his name in a file now. For a man who operates in quiet, that matters." She thought about this. Then, "You planned all of that." "The letter was Garrett's idea," Ethan said. "Telling Marsh about it was mine." She looked at him. "You're more strategic than you let people see," she said. "I'm a mountain rancher," he said. "People see what they expect." She shook her head slowly, not quite smiling, and then briefly doing it anyway. They came over the ridge, and the ranch appeared below them in the afternoon light, and Abigail felt it again. The same thing she'd felt on the ridge the morning she arrived, except larger now and quieter and more hers. Not because she owned it, because she knew it. Because she had worked every part of it and fixed things in it and learned its patterns and its problems. And that was a different kind of belonging than ownership, but it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. They stabled the horses. They went about the work of the afternoon with the ease of long practice, and when Ethan went to the corral to check the young horse and found that the roan with the torn ear had been pressing on the north rail again, he called to Abigail, and they fixed it together in 20 minutes, and she held the rail while he drove the bracing stake, and when it was done, he said without preamble, "Stay." She held the rail. "Stay," he said again. "Not as a hired hand. Not as whatever we've been calling this for 5 weeks. Stay, because this ranch is better with you here, and because I am better with you here, and because whatever you came up this mountain running from, you've earned something you weren't running toward, and I'd like you to have it." She looked at him across the corral fence. "That's not a small thing you're asking," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "I'm not the woman you lost," she said. "I know that. And I'm not a woman who needs saving." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to need anything. I'm asking you to choose." The mountain evening around them. The herd in the lower field. The house with its lamplight beginning to show in the kitchen window. "I have $63, she said. "You have 2 months of wages you haven't been paid," he said. "And a water rights dispute that would have cost me the summer season if you hadn't helped me fight it, and I intend to account for that properly." Ethan. Abigail. Her name again, in that voice that had been stopping the air between them since the first night at the fire. She looked at him. This man who had let her in from the dark, who had stood beside her in a yard full of Marsh's horses, who had held her hand under a courthouse table without making it anything other than what it was, who had looked up from 6 years of grief and chosen to see her standing there. "All right," she said. Ethan Walker looked at her for a moment with everything visible that was usually careful and managed and kept behind those dark eyes. Then he said very simply, "All right." They stood on either side of the corral fence in the last light of a Friday in Montana, and the summer moved around them, and below in Caldwell Creek, a man named Gerald Marsh sat in his hotel room with a scotch and a problem that had just gotten more complicated, and neither of them was thinking about him. They were thinking about supper and the south fence and tomorrow and all the ordinary and extraordinary things that made up the life of people who had decided to stop surviving alone. Inside the house, the lamp burned steady in the kitchen window. It had never in 6 years been lit for company. Tonight it was. The south fence took 3 days, not because it was complicated, but because they kept finding other things wrong while they were fixing it. A post that had rotted through at the base, a section of wire that had been improperly tensioned for so long, it had permanently deformed a drainage issue along the lower run that explained why that stretch of fence had been failing every spring for as long as Ethan could remember. They fixed the fence. Then they fixed the things behind the fence. Then they stood back and looked at the work, and Ethan said, "I should have done this 2 years ago." And Abigail said, "You're doing it now." And that was the end of that conversation. It was not the end of other conversations. Something had shifted after Friday, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the small daily ways that mattered more than announcements. Ethan stopped eating breakfast alone. Abigail stopped going back to the bunkhouse after supper. They sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with coffee and the particular easy quiet of 2 people who had stopped performing indifference to each other. And sometimes they talked about the cattle or the water rights, or what needed doing the following week. And sometimes they talked about other things. He told her about his son one evening. Not the death, he'd told her that already on the fence line in the smoke, but the name. Daniel. He'd been born in November, Ethan said, in a year when the snow came early and stayed late, and he had lived for 3 days, and those 3 days were the best and worst of Ethan Walker's life, compressed into something he'd been carrying ever since in a pocket too private to open. Abigail listened. She didn't reach for words to fill the space around it. She just let it be what it was. "He would have liked it up here," Ethan said, looking at the kitchen table. "Daniel, kids take to the mountains." "He would have," Abigail said. A pause. "You and Thomas," Ethan said. "You didn't have children." "We wanted to," she said. "It didn't happen." Thomas said. She stopped, smiled briefly at the memory. Thomas said, "God was still deciding what kind of people we were going to be, and didn't want to assign us any responsibilities until he'd finished the assessment. Ethan looked at her. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was a gentleman," she said. "That's not always the same thing, but with Thomas it was." The lamp between them. The mountain dark outside. "I'm not a gentleman," Ethan said. "I know that," she said. "It's all right." He held her eyes. "I'm careful," he said. "I'm honest. I work hard, and I keep my word, and I—" He stopped. Jaw moved. "I'm working on the other things, looking up more, saying what I mean before it's too late to say it." She looked at him steadily. "You're doing better than you think," she said. He nodded. Once. The way he accepted things he wasn't sure he deserved, but chose not to argue with. They finished their coffee. She went to the bunkhouse. The distance between the main house and the bunkhouse was 37 feet, which she had not measured but knew by pace. And every evening when she walked it, she was aware of exactly how long 37 feet was, and what it contained, and what it didn't. She was not a woman who rushed things. She was not a woman who waited indefinitely either. 10 days after the courthouse, the letter came. Garrett sent it from Helena with a note clipped to the front that said simply, "Read this carefully. It is good news and complicated news, and you need to know both." The letter itself was from the Territorial Marshal's office. They had opened a formal inquiry into Gerald Marsh's land acquisition practices across 4 counties prompted by Garrett's letter, and apparently 2 other complaints from landowners that had been sitting in a file without sufficient supporting evidence to move forward. Ethan's testimony and documentation about the fire threat, combined with the pattern of complaints now assembled, was enough to elevate the inquiry to an investigation. Gerald Marsh was going to be investigated by the Territorial Marshal. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Abigail. She read it once and set it on the table. "That's the good news," she said. "What's the complicated news?" "They want us to testify," Ethan said. "Both of us, formally, in Helena. The investigation could take months, and until it's resolved, Marsh will know he's under scrutiny, which makes him unpredictable." "Unpredictable how?" she said. "A man who's been operating in the shadows and suddenly sees official attention can go 2 ways," Ethan said. "He either pulls back entirely and tries to wait it out, or he escalates, tries to damage what he can before the investigation closes in." The word sat there. Escalates. "The water rights," she said. "He can't touch those," Ethan said. "They're confirmed." "The deed challenge. Still pending at the county level. He can keep that alive for months, even with the investigation going. And me," she said. Ethan looked at her. "He's already used every official channel he has against you and lost all of them," he said. "What's left isn't official." She understood what he was not quite saying. "You think he'd send someone?" she said. "I think he's a man who has never lost this cleanly before," Ethan said. "And I think losing makes some men reasonable and other men dangerous." She thought about Cole DeWitt, who had ridden into this yard twice now, with Marsh's words in his mouth. She thought about the fire on the North Ridge and the way Marsh had said terrible luck with his eyes showing nothing. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "We need to be more than ready," Ethan said. "I've been thinking about the Rafter J." She blinked. "Tom Jessup's old property. The widow Jessup has been trying to sell it for 2 years. She can't run it alone, and she's too proud to ask for help managing it. If someone bought the Rafter J—" He paused, choosing words. "And that someone had an interest in what happened on this mountain. Then Marsh would have 2 properties watching him from the high ground instead of 1. Abigail stared at him. "You want to buy the Rafter J? I want to make Marsh understand that this mountain is not a place where he can operate quietly anymore," Ethan said. "He wins in isolation. 1 rancher, 1 complaint, 1 court date. He doesn't win when there are multiple properties with connected interests and a territorial investigation on record." "You've been thinking about this since before the courthouse," she said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. "Ethan Walker," she said slowly, "you played a longer game than I knew. I'm a patient man when I need to be," he said. "I just needed someone to remind me that patience without action is just waiting." She looked at him. The lamp. His face in the warm light, direct and certain. You couldn't afford the Rafter J alone, she said. No, he said. I couldn't. The space the word left. She understood it completely. She understood what he was proposing and what he was not saying plainly. And she understood that Ethan Walker was a man who communicated in actions more than words. And that this, all of this, the letter, the plan, the look on his face right now was an action with a great deal in it. That's a business proposition, she said carefully. Partly, he said. What's the other part? He held her eyes. You know what the other part is. She did. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back at him. I need you to say it plainly, she said. Not because I don't understand it. Because I've had things left unsaid before, and I'm not doing that again. He nodded. He understood that. She watched him find the words with the same careful attention he brought to everything. I want you to stay, he said. Permanently. As my partner in this ranch and in whatever comes after it. I want to marry you, Abigail, if you'll have me. And I want to do it because I've watched you for 6 weeks, and you are the most capable and honest and frankly formidable person I have met in 40 years of living, and because this ranch is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I have been alone long enough to know the difference. The lamp burned. Outside the mountain night. I'll have you, she said. She said it the way she said most true things directly without performance, the way you'd hand someone a tool they'd asked for. Something in Ethan's face changed in a way she'd never seen before. Something opened. Briefly, fully, like a window that had been shut for years. Then he cleared his throat, looked at the table, looked back at her. Good, he said. Good, she said. They sat in the kitchen for another hour and talked about the Rafter J and the widow Jessup and the territorial investigation and the South pasture and the cattle count for autumn. And it was the most ordinary conversation in the world, and it was the best conversation of Abigail Carter's life. The news reached Caldwell Creek within a week. That was the nature of small territories. Nothing stayed on the mountain long enough to keep any warmth before it was down in the valley being discussed. Ethan Walker and the Carter woman. Buying property together. And word about a marriage. The town processed this information with the noisy efficiency of a place that had spent 6 weeks expecting something different. Meredith Holt, who had stopped saving Abigail a seat at Sunday service 3 years ago, told everyone at the dry goods store that she had always thought Abigail Carter had good character, and she'd said so from the beginning. Nobody contradicted her because small towns also had a long practice of revising their own histories, and Meredith Holt in particular was a woman who had made contradiction uncomfortable. The dry goods store owner himself, who had gone quiet when Abigail walked in for 3 years, made a point of greeting Ethan Walker by name the next time he came down for supplies and asking after Miss Carter in a tone that was cordial and specific and designed to be remembered. Ed Calloway from the feed store said loudly, and to anyone who would stand still, that he had always known Ethan Walker was a man with good sense, and that the Walker woman, he was already calling her the Walker woman, was the kind of person who made a place better by being in it. The widow Jessup, who had ridden into the courthouse on her brown mare, with her face set and her mind made up, came up the mountain herself on a Thursday to talk to Ethan about the Rafter J. She brought biscuits and a bottom-line number and the particular directness of a woman who had been managing alone long enough to have stopped caring about social niceties, and she looked at Abigail the whole time she was talking to Ethan and said at the end of the conversation, "You'll manage it well. I'd want to know it's in hands like yours." Abigail looked at her. "We'll manage it well," she said. The widow Jessup nodded and shook hands with both of them and ate 2 biscuits and rode back down the mountain, and Ethan looked at Abigail and said, "She came to sell to us, not to me. She knew about you before she rode up here." "People pay attention," Abigail said, "even when they look like they're not." The twist came on a Tuesday. It came the way Marsh's moves always came quietly through channels without his name directly attached. A writer from the county land office appeared at the ranch with a notice that the deed challenge Marsh had filed was being escalated to a full formal review. Not resolved. Escalated. Which meant a county surveyor would be dispatched within 30 days to conduct a physical boundary inspection, and until that inspection was complete, and reviewed the deed status of the Walker Mountain Ranch was technically in dispute. Technically in dispute meant no new financing, no formal property transfer on the Rafter J, no legal completion of anything that depended on clear deed status, which meant Marsh had found his move. He couldn't stop the water rights. He couldn't touch the bank complaint. He couldn't interfere with the marshal's investigation directly without making it worse for himself. But he could slow everything down. Tie up the deed in a 30-day inspection process that cost time and money and the particular exhaustion of people who had already won and were being made to keep fighting. Ethan read the notice. He handed it to Abigail. She read it. "He's trying to stall the Rafter J purchase," she said. "He's trying to exhaust us," Ethan said. "Make it expensive enough and slow enough that we give up pieces of it." "We don't give up pieces of it," she said. "No," he said. "We don't." She thought for a moment. Then, the surveyor. "Who appoints the county surveyor for a formal review?" "County Commissioner's office," Ethan said. "Why?" "Because there are 3 county commissioners," she said, "and I know which one of them has been wanting to move against Marsh for 2 years, but didn't have enough people willing to stand with him." She looked at Ethan. "Commissioner Aldis. I was in the courtroom on Friday. He rode out with the Hale wagon." Ethan was very still. "If Aldis can influence which surveyor is appointed," she said, "and that surveyor can be expedited rather than delayed, the 30-day review becomes a 10-day review," Ethan said. "And Marsh loses his stall," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know about Aldis?" he said. "I kept my ears open for 3 years in that town," she said. "People talked around me because they thought I wasn't important enough to worry about. I heard a great deal." Ethan Walker looked at Abigail Carter for a long moment, with the expression of a man updating his understanding of a situation. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote the letter. Commissioner Aldis responded in 4 days. He appointed a surveyor from Helena, not from the county pool, where Marsh had connections, and the expedited review was scheduled for 10 days out. When Marsh's lawyer filed an objection to the expedited timeline, Aldis's office responded with a procedural memo citing the territorial investigation as grounds for prioritized resolution, which was both legally sound and Abigail thought a thing of beauty. Garrett wrote from Helena to say he had heard about the maneuver and was professionally speaking impressed. Ethan read the letter and looked at Abigail and said, "He's impressed." "I know," she said, stirring the pot on the stove. "You're not surprised." "It was a good plan," she said simply. He stood in the kitchen doorway watching her cook, and she was aware of it, and she let him look because some things didn't need to be commented on. They just needed to be allowed. The surveyor came. He was a precise, humorless man from Helena who spent 2 days measuring everything that could be measured, and another day reviewing the original homestead documentation. And at the end of it, he filed a report that confirmed Ethan Walker's deed was exactly what it said. It was with boundaries, exactly where they had always been, and that the challenge filed against it had no material basis. The deed challenge was closed. They signed the papers on the Rafter J 11 days later in the county land office in Caldwell Creek with Garrett at the table and the widow Jessup across from them, and a notary who kept his expression professionally neutral and only once glanced up with something that was not quite surprise when he registered both names on the application. Abigail Carter and Ethan Walker jointly. She signed her name on that paper with the same steady hand she'd used on everything else in her life, and she felt when the pen left the paper, something release in her chest that she hadn't known was still held, outside the land office on the Caldwell Creek boardwalk. The widow Jessup shook their hands and walked away with the look of a woman who had settled something important. Garrett shook hands with Ethan and tipped his hat to Abigail and said he would be in touch from Helena. Ed Calloway happened to be walking past on the opposite boardwalk and called out that he had good prices on winter fence supplies and that the Walker operation would be getting his best rate. Ethan called back that he appreciated it. And then they were standing on the Caldwell Creek boardwalk in the July heat. And it was almost exactly 7 weeks since Abigail had stood on this same boardwalk with her bags in both hands and Gerald Marsh 20 feet away laughing at something. And the contrast between that moment and this one was not lost on her. Nothing was lost on her. She had a quality which she had always thought of as a burden, and was now beginning to understand as a gift of holding things precisely. Remembering exactly how a moment had felt, exactly what she had known and feared and hoped in it. It meant she carried more than most people. It also meant she knew with more precision than most people exactly how far she had come. "You all right?" Ethan said beside her. "Yes," she said. "Then, I stood here 7 weeks ago and couldn't see any way forward." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you see now?" he said. She looked at the main street of Caldwell Creek, the dry goods store, the courthouse at the end, the hotel where Gerald Marsh had taken his room, the church where Meredith Holt had stopped saving her a seat. And she thought about all of it, the whole complicated machinery of a small town, and its politics, and its cruelties, and its occasional hard-won kindnesses. "The road back up the mountain," she said. He looked at the side of her face. Then he offered her his arm, in the deliberate way. He did things aware of what it communicated, meaning to communicate it. And she took it, and they walked to their horses, and the July sun was hard and flat overhead, and 2 people on the boardwalk across the street watched them go, and one of them said something to the other, and neither Ethan nor Abigail looked back to see what it was. Gerald Marsh left Caldwell Creek on a Friday in August. I didn't announce it. His hotel room was simply empty one morning, and his lawyer was gone, and Cole DeWitt and the other ranch hands on his valley property were given their wages and their notice by a land agent from Billings, who arrived to begin the process of selling Marsh's Caldwell Creek holdings. The territorial investigation, Garrett wrote, had expanded to 6 counties and included allegations that would take years to fully adjudicate. Marsh was not fleeing exactly. He was repositioning, moving his operations to territory where his name wasn't yet in a marshal's file. He was the kind of man who did that, who had enough resources to simply become someone else's problem when a place got too exposed. Ethan told Abigail the news over breakfast. She held her coffee cup for a long moment. "He'll do it to someone else," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "But not here, not to us. And the investigation follows him." She nodded. She thought about the women before her, the ones Marsh had pressured into corners and never made it out. She thought about what it would have meant to have someone stand beside her when she was still standing on the boardwalk with her bags. She thought about the widow Jessup riding into that courthouse on her brown mare, and Margaret Hale, and her revisions, and Ed Calloway, and his feed store prices. "We did something that mattered," she said. "Not just for us." "Yeah," Ethan said. "We did." They finished breakfast. They went to work. The summer turned toward August, with the particular authority of Montana high country, where seasons did not ease into each other, but arrived and departed with a decisiveness that demanded attention. The upper pasture grass was coming back after the fire slowly, but green, which Ethan said was a good sign for the autumn grazing before they brought the herd down. The rafter J needed significant fence work and a new barn roof, and they were managing both properties now with 2 additional hands. Ethan had hired young men who had ridden up the mountain looking for work, and found to their evident surprise that the person who interviewed them and assessed their horsemanship was a woman who asked precise questions and made clear decisions and did not explain herself twice. They came to work. They worked well. One evening late in August, Abigail was at the corral working the gray horse Smoke, who had decided she was acceptable sometime around the 3rd week and had since graduated to trusting her entirely when she heard Ethan come out of the barn and stop. She didn't look up. She heard him lean on the fence. After a while she said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Just watching." "You're always watching. You're always worth watching." She looked at him then, because that was not the kind of thing Ethan Walker said, and the fact that he was saying it meant he had decided to say it, which with this man meant it had been true for a long time. "Don't start being charming," she said. "I won't know how to manage it." Something broke open in his face. A full smile, the first one she had ever seen from him, complete and unmanaged, the kind that changed a face entirely. She stopped working the horse. She looked at him. He looked back. "Reverend Collins is in town on the 2nd Sunday of September," he said. "If you're still of a mind." "I'm still of a mind," she said. He nodded. The smile had settled back into his face in a quieter form, the kind that stayed. "I'm going to start supper," he said. "I'll be in when I'm done," she said. I went back to the house, and she worked. Smoke through another 20 minutes of circles in the cooling evening air, and above her, the Montana sky went from blue to the deep particular gold of high summer ending, and the herd moved in the lower pasture, and from the house came the smell of wood smoke and coffee and something on the stove. The second Sunday of September came with clear skies and a cold edge in the morning air that said autumn was considering its arrival. Reverend Collins was a thin, serious man who performed his function without embellishment, which suited both parties precisely. There were 12 people in the church: Margaret Hale and her husband, the widow Jessup, Ed Calloway, who had brought his wife and appeared deeply moved, though he would deny it later. 2 of the neighboring ranchers who had ridden in from their properties. 3 people from Caldwell Creek who had made their own private reckonings and decided to be present. The 2 ranch hands from the Walker operation scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good shirts. Garrett had sent a letter from Helena. He could not attend. The letter said, among other things, she chose well, and so did you, and I have seldom found a professional matter so personally satisfying. Abigail wore the blue dress, Thomas's favorite. She had thought carefully about that, and she had decided that honoring what had been was not in conflict with choosing what came next. Thomas would have understood. Thomas had been above everything else a man who understood that love was not a finite resource. Ethan wore his good shirt and his hat, and when she walked up beside him, he looked at her the way he had been learning to look fully without managing it, without pulling it back. And she held his eyes, and Reverend Collins said the words, and they said their own, and it was over in 11 minutes, which was about 10.5 minutes less than most people expected, and exactly right for both of them. Outside the church, in the September morning, Margaret Hale embraced her. It was unexpected and brief and genuine. "You changed this valley," Margaret said quietly. "I want you to know I understand that." "The valley changed itself," Abigail said. "I just didn't leave when they expected me to." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, unguarded, and said, "No, you certainly did not." They rode back up the mountain together in the late morning. The 2 of them, the trail familiar now under their horses' feet. The pines unchanged, the rock faces catching the autumn light. They didn't talk much. They had said what needed saying. The rest could be lived. At the top of the ridge where the ranch came into view below them, Ethan stopped his horse. She stopped beside him. He looked at the ranch for a moment. The main house, the barn, the bunkhouse with its window facing the mountain, the corral where the gray horse stood in the morning light, and she watched him look at it with something she had not seen in his face before. Not pride exactly, something quieter, something like recognition. "It's home," she said. "It's home," he said. He reached across and took her hand the way he had under the courthouse table. Not a gesture, not a statement, just a hand holding a hand. And they sat there on the ridge for a moment longer, looking at what they had built and defended and chosen. Below in the valley, Caldwell Creek went about its business. The world continued its complicated turning. Gerald Marsh was somewhere in 2 counties over, finding new angles, and the territorial investigation was grinding its slow official way forward, and the Rafter J needed a new barn roof, and the cattle would come down from the upper pasture before first snow, and there was a winter's worth of work ahead, and after that, a spring, and after that, everything that seasons brought to people who had decided to stay and be counted. None of it was simple. All of it was theirs. Ethan Walker and Abigail Carter had come to each other out of separate darknesses. He from 6 years of grief on a mountain, she from 3 years of being unmade by a town's indifference, and they had found in the space between work and honesty, and the small deliberate kindnesses that do not announce themselves, something that neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed. Not rescue, not even love as the first thing. First, there was work. There was being seen clearly and not flinched from. There was someone saying your worth out loud in a yard full of other people and meaning it. There was standing beside someone when the ground got hard. Love came out of that the way most real things do, out of showing up, out of choosing each day to look up from the work and see who was standing there, out of saying simply and without decoration, all right, and meaning forever by it. The mountain held them both. It always would.